If you're in the market to buy an IEM, you have more options than you'll ever know what to do with. With an unending supply of new releases every month, the IEM landscape is wide, deep, and tall. Simgot Audio sent me their EM2R for review. This IEM costs between $90 and $110. Let's find out what this newer product has to offer. Simgot says that the EM2R is an upgrade from the original EM2. They say that the 2R has a different shape, an updated driver, different tuning with more bass, and a new impedance for use with mobile devices. Most of the marketing is focused on the 2R's design, materials, and technology. There's very little information about actual sound signature. Simgot does say, however, that the 2R is capable of, quote, vivid sound quality as well as smooth and bright high-frequency extension. Scattered throughout their marketing are typical IEM audiophile terms. The crumbs of information we are given suggest a V-shaped sound signature. The 2R does not share the usual IEM aesthetics of its many rivals. It will be a bit hard to confuse the 2R for a product from another company. The 2R's housing is mostly plastic with an elongated design. The Blonde BL Max is also elongated, but where that IEM is meant to sit in the vertical position, the 2R is meant to be worn horizontally. The housing is smooth to the touch. The left and right indicators are clearly printed on each earbud. The IEM is very light. The 2R comes with a detachable 2-pin cable. This cable seems sturdy and pliable, and it transmits very little microphonics. You also get 6 sets of silicone ear tips, some wide bore and some narrow bore. Simgot says that the narrow bore are their balanced sound with more bass and less treble. The wide bore are their transparent ear tips that provide more treble emphasis and clarity. Simgot includes a fake leather case as well. This case will easily hold the IEM and its accessories. As for comfort, I found the 2R fairly comfortable to wear. The IEM sits within my ear cavity and does not dislodge even with vigorous head shaking. I can wear the 2R for about 2 hours before needing a break. Overall, Simgot's aesthetics might put some people off, but the 2R is built well, comes with decent accessories, and is reasonably easy to wear. To test the 2R, I used it with various devices. This includes my RME 80i2 DAC, the Lotu PAW 6000, and the EcoZerta ITM03. I used the narrow bore ear tips and the stock cable. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. I agree with Simgot when they say that the 2R can be driven by mobile devices. You do not need an amplifier for this IEM. Simgot says that the 2R's bass has been enhanced. My tests indicate that this IEM has a mid-bass emphasis. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, there's a rumble from the beginning which builds into a crescendo. The 2R presented this detail, and it was almost as obvious as on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. The transience was similar between these IEMs. When the crescendo hit, the 2R made the organ meld with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was audible, but it did not drown out the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about one step ahead of the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there's a rolling marble sound at the beginning. This pans from right to left to center. The 2R presented this sound and the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the 2R rendered them all similarly. The various drums all had hard impact, and each drum strike melded with the next. The drums were sharper on the 2R compared to the Quarks. I listened to several hip-hop songs, including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On each occasion, the 2R presented the sub-bass, and it sounded similar to the Quarks. The subwoofer always sounded like it was at the middle of a medium-sized room. The vocals were 2 steps ahead of the instruments and retained their sparkle. The drums were louder than the sub-bass. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these tracks to determine if there's any audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion. Overall, the 2R appears to have a mid-bass emphasis. There's about average clarity in this region. My tests indicate that the mids are forward and sibilant. In Orla Gartland's Why Am I Like This, there's natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed into the track. The 2R presented and emphasized both details. The 2R sibilance and vocal grain rendition was greater than what I heard on the Quarks. Orla's voice was 2 steps ahead of the instruments. The Quarks, in comparison, presented oriolus voice one step ahead of instruments. There was some melding among all the instruments, but no muddiness on the 2R. In Watching Back by Haim, the 2R again showed that it does in fact emphasize vocal sibilance. It seemed like there were a few decibels of difference in this regard compared to the Quarks. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary singer says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The 2R rendered this detail. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The 2R initially presented all 3 vocalists clearly with their individual tonalities. When the instruments played at maximum, the backup vocalists melded into one voice, but with some concentration, I could still pick each apart. The drums, bass, guitar, and piano all melded. The drums were the loudest instrument in the mix. The vocals remained 2 steps ahead of the other elements. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the 2R presented the ukulele, drums, and bass. All instruments melded their notes together slightly. The primary male vocalist was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. His vocal sibilance was emphasized by a few decibels compared to the Quarks. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot reveal this subtle detail. The 2R could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The 2R presented this detail. Overall, the 2R seems to have forward mids with particular attention to vocals. Both male and female artists will get a bit of emphasis for sibilance and vocal grain. My tests indicate that the 2R has a marginal emphasis in the low or mid-treble region. In Scherzo for X-Wings, the 2R presented the brass and horns clearly. Their nasally signatures were easily audible. The higher-pitched notes seemed similar to how I heard them on the neutral Quarks. The timpani was audible but did not drown out the other instruments. Some of the brass and horn notes, however, sounded a bit clearer and sharper on the 2R compared to the Quarks. The 2R has some width but no depth or verticality. In other words, some instruments seemed further out into the wings, but none sounded like they were deeper into the room, and no sounds came from above or below. In Flight from the City, the 2R made the piano sound like it was about 6 feet away. Its bassy notes were slightly emphasized. The cello was as loud as the piano, but remained clear throughout the song. I heard the pops and sizzles, electric buzzing effects, creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 by the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the 2R rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, saxophone center, and bass 1 step behind. All instruments melded their tonalities, but none seemed veiled in the mix. The saxophone was the loudest, most obvious element in the mix. The saxophone's higher-pitched notes were similar to what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals were nearly as loud as the saxophone on the 2R. The cymbals are struck at different positions, which should result in varying tonalities, but the 2R made each cymbal strike sound the same. Overall, the 2R seems to have a low to mid-treble emphasis. There's no harshness in the treble region, even at high volumes. Throughout my time with the 2R, I never felt that I was getting greater detail retrieval than what I've heard on other IEMs. The 2R was not able to present nuanced alterations in the voices of multiple vocalists or slight variations of cymbal strikes. Creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, sharp intakes of breaths, multiple vocalists, twangs of guitar strings, nasally signatures of brass and horns. These types of details are clear, but subtle, nuanced details are not any clearer on the 2R than on far cheaper IEMs like the Quarks. For a more quantitative test, I used the song New Light by Kazuki. This track has layers of details, including the sound of children playing, wind, rustling of grass, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of steps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The WG-T2 presents 9 to 10 footsteps. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7 footsteps. The T2 Plus, Blonde BL05, and the The Audio Legacy 2 present 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Quarks, Blonde BL03, and Triple Wind Melee each present 5 to 6 footsteps. And the 2R presented 7 obvious footsteps. For my detail resolution scale, I'll use the Moondrop Aria and the Starfield as my average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the Tin Hi-Fi T2 would be above average. Using this standard, it seems clear to me that the 2R has average detail retrieval. Of course, changing ear tips or insertion depth and your own music may render different results. Simgot says nothing about the 2R soundstage ability. My test suggests this IEM has slightly above average soundstage. However, the 2R does not present a 3D experience, while you might hear some width, the 2R does not excel at depth or verticality. Of course, the original recording has a lot to do with this as well. Just as with the detail resolution test, I also have a scale for Soundstage. For me, this involves, yet again, using the Moondrop Aria and Starfield as the average performers. Anything that has greater or lesser soundstage is judged accordingly. The 10 Hi-Fi T2 and Audeze MS2 have above average soundstage. The Blonde BL03 and the BL05S are average. The Starfield, Aria, and Quarks are also average. I think the 2R is a little bit wider than the Moondrop Aria. However, it appeared to me that the 10 Hi-Fi T2 was wider than the 2R. Simgot's description of the EM2R is not particularly clear. The only thing they underscored is that the bass is elevated. The rest of their marketing is vague at best. Using the balanced ear tips, I think the 2R has a V-shaped signature. Mid-bass is elevated. There is about average clarity and separation between sub-bass and mid-bass. There's little bass bleed into the mids. The mids are forward. Both male and female artists receive an emphasis in vocal sibilance and grain. Vocals stand apart from instruments. Drums are almost always the loudest instrument in a mix. The treble has a low or mid-treble emphasis. Upper treble seems to have a slight roll-off or is very close to neutral. The 2R has average detail and slightly above average soundstage. While Simgot might be correct when they suggest that the treble is not harsh, I am not sure everyone will be happy with the sibilance emphasis this IEM does present. Of course, the only way to know if this type of sound signature is to your liking is for you to just try it yourself. Here, we compare products to figure out if we really need to buy something new. To that end, we will compare the 2R against the 10 Hi-Fi T2 and the Triple Win Melee. For these tests, I used the stock accessories. I plugged each IEM into a passive AB switch, which was connected to my RME 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist and tried to volume match. The T2 and 2R have very different bass responses. The T2 has a noticeable roll-off compared to the neutral IEMs, and against the 2R, it might sound anemic to some. The T2 has faster transients, clearer separation of sub-bass from mid-bass, and no bass bleed into the mids. The 2R has a mid-bass emphasis and greater sub-bass than the T2. The mids are similar. Both have forward mids and both emphasize vocals. Both have a sibilance emphasis, and it appeared to me that this was also to a similar degree. However, the 2R had a bit more vocal grain emphasis. Separation of mid-centric elements was clearer on the T2. The treble is also similar. The T2 has a boost in the mid-treble. The 2R has a boost starting in the lower treble region and extending into the mid-treble. Clarity in this region is a bit more obvious on the T2. Upper treble is marginally more emphatic on the T2. The T2 has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage. The Melee has slightly different bass response. Both IEMs have similar sub-bass, but the Melee appears to have a stronger mid-bass emphasis. The 2R has a bit more clarity and separation in this region. The Melee has greater bass bleed into the mids. The mids are different. The 2R has forward mids, while the Melee has fairly neutral mids but recessed vocals when bass is prevalent in a mix. The 2R is clearer in this region, and there is greater separation of mid-centric elements on the 2R. Treble is different as well between these two. The 2R has an emphasis in the lower and mid-treble, but a fairly neutral rendition in the upper treble. The Melee seems to be fairly neutral until the upper treble, where there's a slight roll-off. Clarity in this region is a bit more apparent on the 2R. The 2R has greater detail retrieval and wider soundstage between these two. Hopefully comparisons like these will give you some helpful information. Obviously, the only way to be sure is to listen for yourself. It's entirely possible that you may not like any of these IEMs or might enjoy all three for different reasons. I think it's getting more difficult to talk about value in the IEM field. We have so much competition with so many different designs that you can find something that fits your style and preferences and budget than you might have imagined, say, several years ago. Gone are the days when you had to look at the premium category for good options. The EM2R has plenty of stiff competition in the $100 region. The Moondrop Aria, Blonde BL03, 10 Hi-Fi T2, and others are rather popular options that Simgot had to differentiate the EM2R from, and I think they succeeded in that regard. When it comes to a V-shaped sound signature, The 2R does not have an aggressive one. For example, the BL03 has noticeably more bass emphasis, more sibilance, and slightly greater treble compared to the 2R. I would say that the BL03 has a more aggressive V-shaped signature than the 2R does. Despite the sibilance and low treble emphasis, the 2R does not seem to become harsh in the treble region. Upper treble appears to be close to neutral. With average detail and slightly above average soundstage, the 2R provides enough resolution for obvious details to pop up in a track. Some might find the 2R signature fun, others might be unhappy. That's all personal preference. The 2R has a light yet sturdy build. It comes with good accessories. And ultimately, I'd say that the EM2R does have a unique value proposition. I think that $110 is a little steep for what you get, but $100 or less I think is probably the more agreeable price point for this IEM.